Newcastle is a city known for its historical architecture. When one walks down the streets of historic Newcastle, they are able to view a plethora of buildings from all different eras of American history, from the famous spire marking the center of the 12-mile circle on the Newcastle Courthouse from 1732, to houses from the American Victorian era. But within historic Newcastle, there is one house known for its opulence in its day, the historical figures that both lived in and visited its walls, and the unique layout and design which is unlike any other house in the city. Situated on the corner of 4th and Delaware Streets is one of the most famous houses in the possession of the Newcastle Historical Society, a house where the stories within are deserved to be heard. This is the story and virtual tour of the Amstel House. Although the name Amstel House is from the 20th century, the name is in reference to the late 17th century. During this period, the European settlements in the Delaware region were primarily Dutch, and the city of Newcastle was then called New Amstel. As such, the name Amstel House calls back to this early period of Dutch rule in Delaware. Indeed, the property that the Amstel House is situated on dates back to this period. The oldest surviving record of the property placed it in the hands of Roloff de Heijs I in 1656. This was long before the house as one knows it today was ever built, but it is still fascinating that this piece of property's recordship dates back to when the Dutch had control of Delaware. But only a few years later, in 1664, the Delaware colonies were seized from the Netherlands' control and placed into the hands of the British, specifically William Penn in 1682. Penn would take control of the Delaware area, making the land a part of his Pennsylvania colony, and New Amstel was renamed into Newcastle during British occupation. During this time, the property changed hands a few times, first to Roloff de Heijs' son Johannes, and then his grandson, Roloff de Heijs II, in 1701. It was then sold to Christopher Stanley in 1707. It was between 1680 and 1707, when Stanley bought the property, that the original building on the property was constructed. Robert and Christopher, Stanley's sons, would inherit the property in 1708. It was not until 30 years later when the property was purchased again, this time by William Goddard. He would not have it for long, selling it that same year to settle a debt with the Newcastle sheriff. The property was bought from him by William Mackey. Finally, later that year, the property was purchased by John Finney, a doctor in Newcastle, and it was he who set out to demolish the small brick building on the property and build the home that we call the Amstel House today. The additions to the building on the property between 4th and Delaware by Dr. John Finney would take place by 1738. By the time the property was completed, it was the largest house in Newcastle. Many came to look at the large house, and although modest in size today, was considered a mansion at the time it was built. Finney owned the house up until his death in 1774, at which point it was passed on to his children, David, Elizabeth, and Anna. After Dr. Finney died, Anna Finney would marry her cousin John, and he would receive ownership of the house shortly after. And once this occurred, he would then begin to lease it to easily the most prominent family in the house's history, the Van Dyke family. The house was first leased to the Van Dyke family between 1775 and 1776. The head of the family was Nicholas Van Dyke, who was notable for being the governor of the state of Delaware from 1783 to 1786. He lived in the house throughout 2 of the 3 years that he was in the governor position. A key part of the history of the house is the number of notable figures who had association with it. Dr. Finney initially built the house to show off his social status at the time, and he was also the uncle of Thomas McKean, one of the Delaware signers of the Declaration of Independence, who studied to be a lawyer under David Finney, his cousin. David, who was John's son and lived in the house when he was young, would become a lawyer, which allowed him to gain enough fortune to become one of the 4 wealthiest men in Delaware. The notable presence of a Delaware governor living in the house also adds to its mystique. But easily, the most well-known story regarding the Amstel House is the visitation by George Washington. Alongside Nicholas Van Dyke, his daughter Anne also lived in the house, and on April 30th, 1784, she and one Kenzie Johns were married at the Amstel House. It is reported that George Washington was present for the wedding reception that day. It was known he was in the Newcastle area at the time, and many in attendance at the reception corroborated the story of his presence. The story is so well known that it is engraved within the Amstel House. In the best parlor's fireplace, a carving within the stone commemorates Washington's visit to both the wedding and the Amstel House. Nicholas Van Dyke lived in the house until 1785, but both Anne Van Dyke and Kenzie Johns lived in the house afterwards. Kenzie was a practicing lawyer during this time, and in 1787, he was a part of the committee that helped to ratify the U.S. Constitution in Delaware, thus making Delaware the first state. Kenzie and Anne continued to live in the house until 1789, which was when the construction of a new home for them was completed. Meanwhile, the home was still under the ownership of the Finney family, up until 1795, when it was sold to Joseph Tatlow. Tatlow was an entrepreneur in Newcastle, known for owning a stagecoach and boat line, and later in his life he was appointed Justice of the Peace for the state of Delaware. The house belonged to Tatlow up until his death in 1808, and even after, it remained in the Tatlow family up until 1832. This marked the year that the house was sold to John Moody, who was a former sheriff of Newcastle and a prominent banker and businessman. The house would be kept in the Moody family lineage for many years. John Moody himself would own the house from his purchase of it in 1832 up until his death in 1854. From there, the house's ownership would be passed to his daughter, Sophia Moody, and then to her niece, Elizabeth V. L. Bird, alongside her husband, a farmer named John Burnham. They had 3 children within the house, but 2 of them died young after a tuberculosis outbreak, as well as John Burnham himself. Elizabeth Bird Burnham would leave the house to be inherited by their surviving son, John Bird Burnham, who was a businessman known for having a hand in passing several national wildlife protection acts. It is of note that when the Amstel House was under Bird Burnham's possession, many changes to the house were made architecturally. The house was used as a boarding house during the ownership by the Moody and Burnham families, and an 1891 photograph shows the house being used as a barber shop. Other rooms in the house were used for other purposes as well, including a tailor shop and as a grocery shop. Finally, in 1904, the house was sold to another private owner, Henry Hanby Hay. The Hay family made many alterations to the house, including the addition of electric lighting and indoor plumbing. The Hays used the Amstel House as a private residence until 1925, when it was sold to Louise Rodney Holcomb, the final private owner of the house. She would sell the house in 1929 to a group of citizens that wanted to preserve the house as a museum, which would eventually become the Newcastle Historical Society in 1934. The society has since made great strides in refurbishing the house in order to make it as close as possible to how the house would have looked during the Van Dyke's residence. The Amstel House is open for private tours by the Historical Society in order to show the history of the house and how it would have looked in the late 18th century. To begin the virtual Amstel House tour, one must note the unusual angle of the house, how its front faces 4th Street rather than Delaware Street. This was a purposeful choice during the house's initial construction. This allows it to be oriented towards the courthouse, which was one of the most important buildings in the state at the time, as well as allow for the symmetrical structure utilized in its architectural style. This is also why the house was often called the corner by its owners, because of the front's unique placement at the corner of the streets. The house is also notable for the style of architecture used in its construction, which is commonly known as Georgian architecture. The brickwork on most of the house is in a style known as Flemish Bond, and it is utilized for most of the public-facing sides of the building. A notable change in the brickwork is at the water table, or base layer of the house, where the brick style switches into a different structure known as English Bond, and the back of the house is built with rough brick. In addition, there are a number of interesting architectural features of the house's exterior, including Doric-style columns at the entryway pediment and the 5-bay gabled front of the house. Moving into the interior, another architectural style becomes readily apparent upon entering the Amstel House, that being a continuation of Georgian architecture. This was a popular style of the time it was built, that placed emphasis on order and symmetry. As such, the house allows for a view into Georgian architecture of the 18th century, while still maintaining a unique structure. The first thing that many people notice when entering the house is the large staircase. This staircase is unique because it is not the original staircase that was constructed within the house. It was added during later refurbishments circa 1775. The original staircase was most likely much steeper and narrower than the one shown today. Moving into the room on the right-hand side of the staircase will bring one into the best parlor. The best parlor was not often utilized. It was primarily reserved for large-scale gatherings and important events. This can be shown with the built-in cabinets on either side of the room's fireplace. Best parlors were often used to show high social class, and the cabinets allowed for guests to view expensive wares that only the very wealthy could collect. This is also the room where Anne Van Dyke and Kenzie Johns were married, and the presence of George Washington at the wedding is memorialized in a carving at the base of the fireplace. The room on the left-hand side of the staircase is what is known as the family parlor. In the 18th and early 19th centuries, the family parlor was the parlor utilized for everyday use by a house's residents, and thus had a multitude of purposes. This was no different in the Amstel House. Throughout its time as a private residence, it served as a dining room, a family room, an office for medical and law practice, and as the room used for the barber shop within the house when the Bird Burnham family owned it. An interesting part of this room is one of the windows within it. This window was once a door used for when the room was being used as an office or shop, to allow access to the room from the street without intruding on the rest of the house. The door was refurbished into a window during the Hayes time in the house. The final room on the first floor, at the back of the house, is the kitchen, or service wing. This was a room primarily used by the household servants to cook for the families living in the house. While it is confirmed that there were enslaved individuals, indentured servants, and hired help in the house, it is not clear if they lived in the house alongside the family. It is possible they could have lived in the Finneys' other properties, and only worked within the Amstel House rather than taking up residence. What is notable about the kitchen, besides the oven used for baking and the cooking hearth, is a part of the wall behind a cabinet in one corner. In the early days of the house, that corner actually had a door that led to a separate staircase, so the servants could traverse between floors without having to interact with the family. While the staircase no longer exists today, it is still a fascinating part of the Amstel House's construction and history. Climbing the main staircase up to the second floor of the house will lead a visitor into one of two rooms. By crossing the landing to the right and entering the side hallway, they will enter into the best bedroom of the house. The best bedroom is elaborately furnished with expensive pieces, and for good reason. In those days, it was not uncommon for people to visit the best bedrooms of a wealthy house. Like the best parlor, it was a space meant to show off the wealth of the family with the furnishings that they were able to put inside the room. An interesting detail about this room is one of the closets on the right-hand side of the room. This closet was originally used as a passageway between the service wing and family bedchambers, where servants could easily move between rooms without entering the main hallway. While it is now a regular closet, evidence of the passageway is still throughout the upper level, which can be seen in another room. Opposite the best bedroom is another bedroom chamber, which has panels lining the walls describing the owners of the house, added by the Historical Society. This room was most likely used as a bedroom for the children living in the house, and a unique feature of this bedroom is a prayer etched into one of the window panes. This has led the Historical Society to believe that the room was once also a nursery for the children. The last room of the house can be found by crossing the staircase landing on the left. This largely empty room has many interesting facets to it. A change in flooring can be found in one corner, which is thought to have been the other entry to the staircase that once led to the kitchen wing. In addition, the outline of a door can be seen on one wall, which is the other end of the passageway that once led into the best bedroom. There are also markings along the ceiling and floor that indicate there were once other walls in this building. But although it is unknown what exactly the walls were used for, it is theorized that they were used as other rooms, either for the household servants or as part of the boarding house during the Moody and Burnham families' ownership. This mystery room is the final room of the house accessible to the public, which closes out the virtual tour of the Amstel House. The Amstel House is a fascinating architectural artifact from the early days of Newcastle. From the notable people who have been inside its walls to the unique design and construction of the building, it is not hard to see why it was considered a fantastically wealthy mansion in its day. And even today, the Newcastle Historical Society aims to preserve and protect the house, so that others may see what life was like for the people living in it, from the Finneys to the Van Dykes, all the way up to the Bird Burnhams and Hayes. Overall, the Amstel House is one of the most interesting buildings in Old Newcastle, and stands today as a testament to the earliest days of this city's rich, intricate history.